Hi, Carol Boyce Davies, coming from Cornell University and bringing greetings to my colleague and friend, Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles, all my colleagues at the University of the West Indies, and my larger Caribbean community. Greetings. Today I'm going to talk about reparations, knowledge, and the De-colonial University. In the introduction to Decolonizing the Academy, 2003, a collection of essays, one of the products of a conference on African Diaspora Studies during my 10 years Director of African Diaspora Studies at Florida International University, I asserted that the Academy, meaning the university and the larger knowledge production apparatus, remains one of the most colonized of spaces. In every discipline, one is confronted with the production of knowledge that assumes European epistemologies and ideas as the only significant ones or recognized ideas to be circulated. This thereby creates a hierarchy of knowledge in which African people's experiences still remain at the bottom in the same measure as our Black lives still today. Sylvia Wynter, in Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, Freedom Toward the Human After Man, Its Overrepresentation and Argument, asserts that our current struggles are to secure the well-being and therefore the full cognitive and behavioral autonomy of the human species, ourselves that is, in the face of Western bourgeois conception of the human, which represents itself as though it were the only human, the human itself that is. For Wynter, then, struggles of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, the sustainability of the environment in the face of global warming, severe climate change, the sharply unequal distribution of the earth's resources are part of a systematic pattern to claim our humanity in the face of this Western bourgeois ethnic class man, which claims humanity for himself, along with all the world's resources, I would add, and leaves us constantly having to reassert our rights, our humanity, our right also to breathe. Significantly, Wynter herself had earlier in her work at the Institute of the Black World defined or understood Black studies as an insurgent field organized to provide a knowledge component of the various political and social movements, demanding correction then at the epistemological or knowledge production level. However, she saw the current iteration of Africana studies or Black studies as having lost its way. On how we mistook the map for the territory and re-imprisoned ourselves in our unbearable wrongness of being, of the etc., Black Studies Toward the Human Project, she recalled some of those aesthetic and political movements which actually wanted a whole new system of ideas. Instead, we never arrived at the new place. Instead of having fully arrived at the territorial place where we could claim to rewrite the script of anti-Blackness then, we ended up being re-territorialized under Eurocentric whiteness and its assumptions of the control of knowledge, thereby a continued violence at the epistemological level, which also leaves us unable to breathe. The graphic representations of the visual I can't breathe suffocations ended up having symbolic resonances and multiplicative effect, as we saw during the activism of this past year. Essentially, declining material conditions continue to suffocate the masses of Black people in many locations. And in advancing these paradigms, the academics in the neo-colonial or post-colonial context, if we follow Walter Rodney's argument, are the ones, therefore, creating the limits, i.e., the ruling class, the ideas of the dominant class remain status quo, the systematizing and institutionalizing of racism, class and gender exploitation, and the appropriation of labor of others, particularly women, as Claudia Jones would term it, in her super exploitation of the Black woman thesis, remain then part of the normative handling of us in these institutional contexts. Thereby, the idea of the acceptance of the status quo is built in to the academic context. Even Africana studies then, meant to be transformative, has not extended to match the current knowledge available in fields and the geographical reach of the Black experience, remaining only then with partial coverage of US African American experience and perhaps a little African history, very little Caribbean coverage. So how do we repair this damage that has gone on and that has been done to the black person, the black subject, and go back therefore and reclaim some of this lost direction, go back then to the map as it were? First of all, every discipline in the current university context has to be minimally a counter discourse or have it represented within its curricular and research frameworks as a counter narrative. Such is the case, for example, in our recent move to change the name of Cornell's English department, and with that change also its curricular representations, so that medieval Europe, medieval studies, and the pre-18th century England is not the dominant distributional mandate for students as it is now. We argued then, following Ngugi wa Thiong'o's et al. Abolition of the English Department 1968, that the English departments have tended to be one of those institutions complicit in maintaining dominant structural inequities by the very nature of their namings and orientations in terms of what they teach and how they teach it. We were pleased that our department included, ahead of this change, a vibrant body of subjects of inquiry which were not captured by the current naming. So we began a series of discussions to challenge ourselves and our context, resulting in the document that our colleagues, by their affirmation as signatories, have demonstrated that the need then to create a more just and equitable department, arguing then for a move to a Department of Literatures in English. I want to make one substantial point then within this context of talking about reparations claims and what I call the De-colonial university. The CARICOM reparations claims represents a renewed aspect of an ongoing historical conversation about what is still owed black people, approachable from a variety of viewpoints, from post-enslavement demands for repatriation and reparations, to Rastafari, in Cobra, and of course the current CARICOM movement. In fact, if we use the lens of, let's say, the Black Lives movements, we can, and I say movements in plural deliberately, we can assert that they carry at their core the argument that black lives are often without value in the scheme of things, from police brutality on the streets to the academy, and therefore to coverage, right? The normalizing of black objection then has always been the need to be challenged in this new attempt to reclaim humanity and put us back on the table, it seems, historically. So how do we talk about this? Among the reparations claims, as you know, we have, and I'll repeat the list just because I need to pull out one of them: full formal apology, repatriation, Indigenous Peoples Development Program, cultural institutions, public health crises, illiteracy eradication, African Knowledge Program. That's the one I want to linger on for a bit. Psychological rehabilitation is number 8, technology transfer number 9, and debt cancellation number 10. So the one I want to focus here is, of course, the knowledge one. So several of these reparative claims we can do ourselves, of course. Several require government intervention, debt cancellation, and so on. Reparations, as we know, does not only assume that it is only a governmental to people process of handouts, but a series of reparative steps. What is in our purview then in the context of an institutional academic context? This is the knowledge production area. This is the one I want to talk about briefly here, the epistemic, therefore. I want to therefore linger on that for a minute. In the reparative justice item under knowledge, this is what it says. The forced separation of Africans from their homeland has resulted in cultural and social alienation from identity and existential belonging. Denied the right in law to life and divorced by space from their source of historic self, Africans have craved the right to return our knowledge of the root to roots. A program of action is required to build bridges of belonging. Such projects as school exchanges and culture tours, community and artistic performance programs, entrepreneurial and religious engagements, as well as political interaction, are required in order to neutralize the void created by slave voyages. Such actions will serve to build knowledge networks that are necessary for community rehabilitation. Doing quick cultural analysis then, as we do, some items jump out right away. cultural and social alienation from identity and existential belonging, knowledge of the root to roots, building bridges of belonging, neutralizing the void created by the slave voyages, building knowledge networks that are necessary for community rehabilitation, right? Those are some of the quick cultural terms that jump out at us right away. But how does all of this matter then in the current university, as we said from the start, a site of colonized identities? In my view then, we have to imagine a decolonial university. This decolonial university is my imagined university. It's an impossibility in that larger meaning, aspirational nonetheless, but therefore possible, right? As we consider a range of subjects for larger advancing of knowledge, there still remains then incomplete knowledge acquisition process that continue that epistemic violence on our students unless we ourselves are able to account for, at least admit, missing areas of study, i.e. what is left out. Putting in place then a pattern to ensure that the scholarship of thinkers from a range of locations have equal access rather than the exportation of products always including knowledge in a unidirectional model. In other words, the knowledge process I'm suggesting often comes Europe or US to these other locations, whether you're talking about Africa or the Caribbean, and often not the other way around. So in my view then, a decolonial university will have to attend to that question of how we reposition the directional relationship between how knowledge is produced. The possibilities include, for me, going back then to reclaim the original impetus which started many of the movements for Black liberation, going all the way back probably even to the 1900 Pan-African Conference to see what they were arguing. And the point I'm making is that there have been a series of conferences and resolutions and meetings from throughout the entire 20th century with this in mind, this attempt to really get at how do we rehabilitate the Black experience. So to me, one has to go back then and study those, see what's usable and see what's available to be applied if we want to talk about the whole question of decolonizing the knowledge or the institutional process. Go back for me, for sure, to reclaim the initial impetus of Black Studies programs, departments, and institutes, many of which remain captured by sometimes very specific interests, still battling for space sometimes in that same university hierarchy. Create new paradigms that go beyond the received nation-state formations which dominate now. And I want to suggest in all of that, and it seems gratuitous because I'm from the Caribbean, but for me, Caribbean studies, which is often a drop in the academic ocean, rejected even by some Africana studies departments, can easily be one of the centers of concentrations of Black experience anywhere and radiate from that in terms of how knowledge is produced. Indeed, in my view, Caribbean universities should be those places from which all of this knowledge of the Caribbean emanates, especially in this time of post-COVID technological communication advancements. And finally then, how does a university respond to its community's needs? A project then, for me in the larger context of the community, has to address the way that children are taught, the way that our community gets knowledge in general. And this probably is an issue that still remains, that has to be constantly addressed as we move forward. So as we move then beyond the colonial university, we can begin to imagine a decolonial university then moving outside of the boundaries then of the institutional frameworks, which I'm suggesting is what has just happened in this post-COVID technological advancement. We've actually moved out of the walls of the university. I, for example, teach in a different context than I did before, and many of us are doing the same thing, right? So we navigate always, on the one hand, then with a past of dignity and legendary greatness, and on the other, the starkness of the initial history of dispossession, economic difficulty, brought on sometimes by our own horrendous leadership, often in collusion with external actors. Think of Nigeria, right? And the fact that you would have that kind of move from Nigeria, which was referred by this current president, who I call the past president, as a S-hole country. And then you have the president still endorsing it, but also using a lot of the paradigms and and ideas that come from this particular leader. And also the ways in which you can see the manipulation of people via the evangelical machinery, which then brings people out on the streets in support of the president thousands of miles away without even knowing probably sometimes what they are supporting. So what remains always then is a series of conflicting representations, but above all, a definition of an unrelenting humanity for African people, from what it takes to survive in the harshest conditions to how one begins again after everything falls apart, but also definitely for us to know how one lives a life of beauty and joy in spite of it all. Thank you very much.